Welcome, everybody. So thank you for coming. So this is our first presentation of the Reality Lab lecture. So many of you may know that the UW Reality Lab launched earlier this year. We're very excited about that. We've rolled out a ton of exciting research projects and a lot of initiatives coming out for educating the next generation of researchers and developers and creators in virtual and augmented reality. And one of the things we wanted to do was to bring to you some of the greatest minds in the field in augmented and virtual reality. And so here is one of those great minds. Our inaugural presenter for the series is Gordon Wetzstein. So Gordon did his PhD with Wolfgang Heydrich at UBC, went on to do a postdoc with Ramesh Raskar at MIT, and since then has been a professor at Stanford University in the electrical engineering department. Has been doing amazing work there for several years now with his focus on computational imaging and displays. And I'm very excited to hear what he has to say about some of that great work.
Great. Thank you so much for the introduction, and thanks for coming out on this last day of the quarter. What I'd like to talk to you about today is some of the tech that goes on behind the scenes of making AR and VR happening. So wearable computing, like AR and VR, is widely believed to be a next major computing platform. One of the big benefits that it offers is the seamless interface between the digital world and the physical world. For that to happen, we kind of think about optical see-through AR a lot. I know that there's a lot of work on video-based AR going on here, but we think about optics a lot, headsets, how to build these seamless interfaces. And so the near-eye display is really the primary interface between the user and the digital world. It's supposed to be wide field of view, high resolution, high dynamic range, high peak brightness, low power, wearable, and so on and so forth. So there are a lot of challenges, and some of these we'll be talking about today. So AR and VR has, of course, applications in many different domains. VR mostly in gaming right now, but potentially also education, traveling to distant places that you couldn't reach otherwise. Some of my favorite applications include robotic surgery. So the Da Vinci robotic surgical system is basically an AR system, if you want. It's a robotic arm or 5 robotic arms that are remotely operated by a surgeon who's looking into this box on the left there. And, visual comfort, image quality are really important if you want the surgeon to perform a procedure on you for hours at a time. Also, remotely operating vehicles like these drones is a really big thing. So I wasn't really aware of that until a couple of months ago, but these drone racing world championships are all done by people flying these drones at incredibly high speeds through crazy mazes and remotely operating them with low latency headsets. So in that case, the requirements on the tech are more on the latency than on the field of view and things like that. But AR and VR also enable completely new and unprecedented applications. So I left the placeholder for Alice in Wonderland over here and on the lower right. So basically, I think about VR and AR as a new medium that allows us to generate experiences that are very different from what we know from television, film, gaming, and so on and so forth. But people have to learn how to use this medium to tell these stories and create compelling applications. And hopefully you will be among the bright people who come up with these types of experiences. So at Stanford, there's a lot of interest on AR and VR, especially actually in the medical school. So in the hospital, people use VR in particular to alleviate anxiety and pain for pediatric patients. So you can think about a child wearing a headset and seeing some kind of a immersive experience to help overcome fear of getting a procedure done or things like that. There's actually a whole VR technology clinic, also for training, of course, for mental health, for people with phantom pain, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of activity going on in that space, and that's just something that's already happening today. So it's not just a technology of the future, it's something that's happening today. I'm an engineer by training, computer scientist, now electrical engineering, and as an engineer, I'm really excited about AR and VR because there are so many different challenges that we can work on. And these challenges include pretty much everything in this ecosystem that includes cameras to record immersive content in stereo, It includes all the compute that goes on in the cloud for things like that. It includes the chips that do low latency, low power processing for things like CPU, GPU, image processing unit, but also chips that are directly driving the pixels on the displays. So there's a lot of room for innovation in that space. And then, of course, on the sensors, computer vision, the imaging, low-level vision, scene understanding, a lot of the things that are going on here, lighting estimation, occlusions, animating photographs, things like that. These are all big challenges on the computer vision and image processing side. Then on the optics side, you have things like waveguides and the photonics that are very important to build, small form factor glasses and deliver these highly compelling experiences. And then we talk about the displays a lot, but there are many other sensors that humans use, such as the audio system, the vestibular system, our sense of gravity, haptics, and so on. So there's a lot of research going on in all these different domains. And that's what makes it so exciting from my perspective. So today we'll talk mostly about some aspects of human perception, especially on the visual side, and some of the display technology that we've been developing, and others also in that side. So just keep in mind that this is a really big area, and probably over the course of these lectures, you'll get insights into many of these different areas. So the big vision for on the optics side and the devices side is to get these devices into a form factor that we already know. So if we look around in the room, more than probably 50% of the people are wearing glasses already. So if we could integrate the technology into a device form factor like this with very low power requirements, that would be ideal because it doesn't require anything extra. But it does seem a little bit like science fiction because we need to integrate a big computer into the form factor of the frames of these glasses. We need to turn the glasses into a display, and so on and so forth. So it sounds a little bit like science fiction, but if we think about what we've already achieved in terms of technology developments, starting in the 80s with desktop computers or room-sized computers, and the types of experiences that they would deliver at the time, they were very limited, right? But then over the course of only maybe 20, 30 years, we've shrunk down this compute power into cell phones that fit in our pockets. And just to give you a sense of how far we've come along, just on the cell phone that you have in your pockets today, that's probably only about 1,000 times more compute power than the computer that was on the Apollo mission that propelled man to the moon. So within a few decades, we shrunk compute into wearable form factor with massive amounts of processing power. And so thinking about the next generation as wearable computing is just a natural step forward. So we can think about this as the future of mobile compute technology, but then people have really been working on it for a long time already. And here's my version of a brief history of VR. So starting in the 1830s, we've had things like the stereoscopes where people would gather in these Victorian times and look at these stereoscopic photographs. You can actually find a large collection of stereoscopic photographs from the American Civil War in the Library of Congress, which is all available online. So it's really nothing new in that sense. In the 60s, people like Ivan Sutherland and others worked on making this technology electronic, so we could do computer graphics, compute images that would be overlaid with the physical environment, working on the tracking and other aspects. I'll talk more in detail about this in a second. It's not the first time now that we've seen consumer electronics type devices. Nintendo actually had the Virtual Boy as a consumer electronics product on the market in the mid-90s already. We'll see in a second why that may have not been quite successful yet at the time. And then over the last 6 years or so, we've seen a big explosion on VR, starting with Oculus, obviously. But now there's a lot of stuff going on in this domain. And let's say in the academic world and in the research labs of the world, we're thinking about, okay, what's really the next generation of these displays? And that's what we'd like to focus on today. But just to give you a sense of what people have done already, this is Ivan Sutherland's HMD that he called the Sword of Damocles. It was suspended from the ceiling. It had 2 CRT displays that would be feeding images in from the side. So there are already beam splitters that allow you to get optical see-through capabilities. So it was a true optical see-through AR display. It had computer graphics, which was just at its infancy at the time. Head tracking using ultrasound and mechanical tracking, interaction, model generation, and so on and so forth. So the group at that time worked on all these different aspects like human-computer interaction, computer graphics, robotics, electronics, and so on, all at the same time to make something like this happen. And I think that's a lesson that we should learn today, is that big innovations really come at this intersection of multiple different fields. And if we go on into our own convenient communities, that's great, but we're probably not going to be able to make a big jump there. So the Nintendo Virtual Boy was a stereoscopic display that was available. You can buy that on eBay even today for maybe $100 or so. But the computer graphics hardware wasn't quite ready at the time yet. So what GPUs could do in this context were very simple, low-resolution line renderings, and those are just not very immersive or really interactive or really realistic. And so today we have GPUs that can really generate photorealistic content at real time, at high resolution, stereoscopically, and that's a really big difference. So I would go so far as to say that the cell phone industry has really enabled this latest breakthrough in VR technology, because if you look at what's inside a headset today, it's actually pretty standard components, lenses that we know pretty well, injection molded plastic. But then we have these really small high-resolution screens, and those really enable, high-resolution immersive experiences. And then also the tracking system. So IMUs, inertial measurement units, that are in your phone also, that are low cost, low latency, and very, very precise, enable orientation tracking, for example. And I think these two components with the clever hardware architecture and the graphics pipeline were really what enabled the DK1 and this recent success of VR again. But so how far have we really come from these stereoscopes? Well, the basic principles of operations remain the same today. I mean, we have interactive experiences. We can share them with our friends over the internet, and we can dynamically update that. So that's great. But the optical principles haven't really changed all that much. So just to give you a sense at a very high level of what's happening here is we have two lenses in front of a cell phone or any other kind of a micro display. The lenses basically act as magnifiers. They create what we call a virtual image, as a magnified version of that image that's close to your eye that just floats in space. So you're basically looking at a 2D plane that's magnified at some distance away, maybe 2 meters or so. And using simple equations, we can actually predict exactly where that object is going to be floating based on the focal length and the physical distance between the microdisplay and the lens. We know exactly where this virtual image is going to be. And that's not really a natural viewing experience, because you basically look at two floating planes, one for each eye. So there's a couple of problems with that. It's a fixed focal plane display. It doesn't support focus cues that we use in a natural environment. I'll get back to that in a second. And it doesn't really drive accommodation. So we can't focus our eyes really to that. And we can't change that in software. So focus cues are a really important part of human vision. They give you a sense of the spatial layout of the scene that you're looking at. The defocus cues help you understand, which objects are in front of which other ones. They give you a sense of scale also, and they're very important for visual comfort also, which I'll talk about in a second. But you need to understand that focus cues are differently important for different types of people. So this is a plot from a paper from 1912, where you have age from 8 to 72, plotted against the closest distance that the person can focus, assuming they can also see sharp at infinity. So when we are very young, the crystalline lenses in our eyes can deform in a way that allows us to refocus to arbitrary distances. But as we get older, we get this condition called presbyopia, which simply means that the lenses in our eyes get stiff and we can't deform them anymore. So at the end of the day, they're going to be fixed focal power lenses. And we need reading glasses, bifocals, or other types of vision correcting glasses to be able to correct that. So this condition is really important to understand how we should drive focus in VR as well. So taking a step back again, I talked about these focus cues a little bit, but how do they compare to other types of cues? So the human visual system uses many different cues to see 3D or depth. So the idea of 3D doesn't really mean anything by itself. There are many different cues that feed independent signals to the brain. And I'm just going to classify them here as stereoscopic cues and monocular cues. So those that are using both eyes and those that are just using a single eye. And then we're going to have oculomotor cues and visual cues. So vergence is an oculomotor cue that is sent from the muscles that are rotating the eyeballs in their sockets to the brain directly. And if you fixate at an object that's far away, the eyeballs are going to rotate out and they're almost going to be parallel. If you look at something close, they're going to rotate inwards. And this is simply to keep the object that you're fixating directly on the fovea, because the fovea is the area on the retina that has the highest spatial acuity, right? So this oculomotor cue, vergence, is driven by binocular disparity. And that's simply the fact that we see two different images with the eyes, so two slightly different perspectives. Most people consider this as stereoscopic 3D, basically. But if you can render in these cues in computer graphics, you can automatically drive the vergence cue. So now accommodation is a monocular cue. It's the deformation of the lens, the crystalline lens in your eye. And these are driven by the ciliary muscles. The focus cues, this accommodation, is driven by retinal blur, and that's the defocus. So you can think about the focus cues really as an autofocus mechanism of your eye. Whatever object you want to look at, I mean, there's going to be some kind of autofocus mechanism that brings that object in focus. And in the real world, these cues are all coupled. That just makes our brain work more efficiently because we can use this cross-correlation between these different cues. So I want to talk a little bit more about these focus cues also because they're very important for VR and not supported today. So if you look at a display that is at some fixed distance or the virtual image of the VR display, right? You never look at the micro display itself. You look at the magnified virtual image of it, and it appears at some distance. If you're going to be accommodated somewhere else, the image is going to be blurry, obviously. It's very simple and intuitive to understand that if you're not accommodated, it's going to be blurry, but many people don't get that right away, and it helps us understand later the problems of not supporting focus cues. So as we accommodate to different distances, the image gets sharper up until the point where the image is in focus and then it's sharp, right? So if you're working in the world of optics, you usually characterize things like that using the point spread function of the display. So if you turned on a single pixel on the display and everything else is black, then depending on the accommodation state of the lens, you're going to get something like this. What the autofocus mechanism of the eye does is tries to find the sharpest image or do kind of a gradient descent on the retinal blur. I'll get back to that concept also later. So one of the things that emerges from the lack of focus cues by just shining, basically presenting these two images, flat images to each eye, is this vergence-accommodation conflict. And the vergence-accommodation conflict comes from the mismatch of vergence and focus information in VR or AR displays. So again, in the real world, as you look at different objects, our eyes are going to be verging to keep the fixated object on the fovea, and they're going to be accommodating to keep them in sharp focus at the same time. So these are linked together, and vergence accommodation match. In VR and most AR systems, these are decoupled. So you're going to render in these stereo images and drive the vergence to arbitrary distances, but the focus of the eye, the accommodation, is always linked to the virtual image or the screen. Simply because if it wasn't, we wouldn't see a sharp image, as I was just showing you, right? So that means by default, if you want to see a sharp image in a stereoscopic display, your eyes have to be accommodated on the actual screen, which means that they're by default not wherever they should be based on the vergence. So this mismatch between vergence and accommodation is known as the vergence-accommodation conflict. And it's been shown in many studies that for long-term use, let's say longer than 20 minutes or so, it creates discomfort, eye strain, tiredness, and so on and so forth, and it negatively degrades performance in specific tasks. So think about the Da Vinci surgical system again. If your surgeon is looking into this box for hours at a time, performing a surgery on you, you really want to make sure that they don't have eye strain and that performance is up to speed. So for short-term effects, you also see double vision, so the inability to fuse stereoscopic image pairs. You're going to lose visual clarity because the vergence is going to try to drive your accommodation away from that screen. And so if it is successful, you're going to lose visual clarity, so the images look blurrier. And people also get nausea to some extent. So some of the research questions that are interesting here are, how can we address this vergence accommodation conflict? What are good technologies for that? How do we address it for people of different ages? And then a lot of different proposals have been done on technologies in this space and which ones of these are actually effective. So I want to talk about a few of these. The first one is varifocal displays or gaze-contingent focus. That's probably one of the most intuitive ones. So going back to this fixed focal plane display, we have a fixed focal length and a fixed distance between the micro display and the lens. That creates the virtual image that's floating somewhere in space outside of the physical device. But to dynamically change that, we could use something like an actuator. So the actuator would physically move the microdisplay and thereby change this distance here. If we change the distance, we're going to change the distance of the magnified image. And with a very small amount of motion inside the headset, we can actually create a very large motion of the virtual image. So only about a motion of about a centimeter or so will actually allow you to drive the virtual image over the entire accommodation range. The other way of doing it is using what's known as a focus-tunable lens element. So in this case, we're going to change the focal power of the lens, which changes this parameter, but equivalently, it changes the distance of the virtual image without any mechanical motions. So this idea really isn't really new. Even the first types of immersive experiences, like these arcade-type experiences, had or manually adjustable focus just to dial in your prescription, basically. The first paper treating the subject that I found was from 1984 from Henry Fuchs's group at UNC, and they basically took a loudspeaker, coated it with a reflective material, and then reflected a CRT monitor in that to create computer graphics images at multiple different distances. And so over the last 10 years or so, we've seen better versions of focus-tunable optical elements emerging, and that's something that a lot of people have started to use. So I started with the vision of making VR small, or AR. We've probably built the world's biggest VR display in this case. This is a benchtop setup that is really good for user studies. And what's in there is two high-resolution displays on the side. We have these relay optics systems. We just use camera lenses because they're really well calibrated for chromatic aberrations and just optical image quality. We have these focus-tunable lenses in there that are really fast also, about 15 milliseconds settling time, which means that you can change the focus at 60 hertz. We have these beam splitters, which are great because we can now see the images from the side, but we can also see through it, so we could use it as an AR display also. Translation stage could be used to adjust the interpupillary distance, which is very important. We actually use the other optical path for this autorefractor. So this is a machine that you'd find in an optometry office usually, and it will measure the accommodation state of the user. So this device allows us to present stereoscopic images and measure the response of the user as a really unbiased way of measuring the effectiveness of different types of technologies, of different ways of delivering the images to the user. And we wanted to do a couple of very simple tests in actually verifying this hypothesis of, if you have a fixed focal plane in your display, the hypothesis was that, if you render a target that's away from that plane, your vergence would be driven to that distance, but the accommodation would be linked to the focal plane of the display. Similarly here, vergence is here at the rendered target, whereas the accommodation would be linked to the actual focal plane of the display. Whereas if you actually link the two together and dynamically drive the focal power of the lens, you could attach it to the rendered target and thereby drive vergence accommodation to the same distance. So at least that's the hypothesis. So the test that we did was very simple. We just rendered a cross and move it in and out of the screen in a sinusoidal fashion from 2 meters, which is 0.5 diopters, to about 25 centimeters, which is 4 diopters. So people in the vision science community usually measure distances in diopters. So that's pretty much the entire accommodation range. And here's kind of the data that we got, measured from actually a large number of participants. So here we have time, 25 seconds. And then this is the diopters of the render target. So it goes in, away from you, and then towards you, away from you, towards you, and so on and so forth. So it's a really boring scene. You just see this cross moving in and out. And we asked the user to look at it. And then assuming that they will actually fixate at that particular target, we're going to measure their response. And what we got was a little bit surprising, but not very surprising, is that we got this. These are the individual responses, the gray ones, and this is the average response. I mean, we do get a little bit of response, about a gain factor of 0.3, which means that the vergence will actually drive accommodation to some extent, right? And if it was to drive accommodation to more, then it would pull away the focus from the plane, and you'd get problems with visual acuity, and it gets blurry. Yes?
So is this with a physical object, or this is with the system trying to...
This is with the system rendering in a target that doesn't change its size. So the size will remain the same. All visual cues are exactly the same, independent of the depth. The only thing that changes is the disparity. So then we know that, okay, with the render disparity, we're going to likely drive vergence to whatever distance the target has. And now we want to see, where's the accommodation at the same time.
How do you measure accommodation?
With that autorefractor. So the autorefractor is the big machine. It has, so it operates in near infrared. It has a ring of LEDs that will cycle through it and actually measures defocus and also astigmatism at any point in time at about 5 hertz. So the response time of accommodation is about 300 to 500 milliseconds. So with a 5 hertz measurement apparatus, you should be able to get pretty good data on, where's the user accommodated. Okay. So it's not flat. We would have assumed it to be flat, right? To always fix on the actual physical screen, but it does move a little bit. Okay, so now the dynamic response. So in this case, we would assume that, well, we're going to link the focal plane of the display to the rendered target, and ideally it should match exactly what we see here, right? So what we found is that it doesn't quite match it. Disregard the phase. We haven't synchronized them exactly. We're just looking at the amplitude here, and we get a gain of about 77%, which isn't as great as we had hoped. But the problem here is that we actually just tested a whole bunch of people and discarded their age, right? So as I was saying earlier, with age, the crystalline lens stiffens, and some people you lose the ability to actually focus. So it doesn't matter what you show the person, they simply won't be able to focus. So if we break up this data into age versus gain, where a gain of 1.0 would be perfectly following the stimulus, then we get something like this for the conventional mode with a fixed focal plane. So you do actually see a little bit of response here and a couple of outliers, but it reduces over age. And then with this dynamically adjustable focus mode, it actually looks pretty good for these people over here. But then again, I mean, as you age, you're not going to be driving anybody's focus. So what's a little bit strange is that there are these data points over here that are larger than 1, which means that people actually over-accommodate. And we tried to explain that by looking into the vision science literature, and actually it turns out that people have found that with physical stimuli too. So here's a paper from 2004 from Berkeley where younger people will actually over-accommodate if you're looking at these sinusoidally varying stimuli. So this is interesting, and basically just shows that we see the same trends with this varifocal technique, but so far we've only looked at a target that's very small, right? Just a single rendered object, and we ask people to look at this.
So since people with actual objects have all these differences, what's the kind of error tolerance that we should really be targeting with these kinds of displays?
That's a very good question. Error tolerance of plus minus maybe a quarter a diopter would probably be fine, because the eye actually oscillates low frequency within that range anyways, and you don't see a lot of visual degradation in that space. So this is not something that needs to operate super fast or super accurate, right? But one thing that it does need to do is it actually needs to work in a gaze-contingent mode, because so far we've only looked at one object, and if you have an immersive display with a large field of view, you don't know what the user is looking at any point in time. So you actually really need the eye tracking for this to work, and then based on what you're looking at and how far away that object is, you need to adjust the focal plane of the display dynamically to that. And so here's our prototype that we built basically in 2016. We have a stereoscopic eye tracker in here that, again, operates in near infrared, so you don't actually see it. It shines light into the eye, measures, in this case, the gaze direction. We have a big motor that is not very comfortable, but it allows us to quickly change the focus of this gear VR. So we just had a ring that was coupled to the manual focus adjustment, so it's really just a hack, really. But worked pretty well. You can see it in real time here. We can actually change the focal plane over a range of 3 to 4 diopters within 300 milliseconds. So it's pretty heavy, but it is fast. And that worked pretty well for the first, I would say this is almost the first gaze-contingent varifocal display that was really demonstrated. And then, so kind of what it does is this, right? So this was the data that we captured. In this case, the red circle corresponds to what the user is looking at. And just stay with me for a second. So the user looks at an object that's close by, farther away, and immediately the display plane would adjust to that focal distance. And then we filmed it with a camera that had manual focus adjustment. So we just, turn the focus wheel of the camera to follow where the display goes, which the eye would normally do automatically within these 300 milliseconds, right?
the manual focus is slower than the actual.
Yeah, in this case, we're just going to try to adjust it, which is what the eye would do automatically. So all you're seeing is that as soon as the user looks at a different object, immediately the display adjusts its focal plane, right? So we actually showed this in 2016 at SIGGRAPH. Some of you may have tried it there. It was a user study in disguise, which was one of my best ideas of that year, because we got access to like 175 people, measuring them within a couple of days, and they saw a really cool demo also. So that was great, and the technology is pretty straightforward, but it's actually not that straightforward to actually build it. If you've seen the F8 developer conference this year, that was just in May, you may have seen the half-dome prototype from Oculus. So here's a video that is courtesy of Oculus that actually has this technology integrated. So in this case, I mean, I can only speculate, but it looks like it's mounted on a couple of rails. We have these mechanical deformations, probably with some kind of an actuator that moves these displays independently along these rails. And so the way they advertised it was actually with this visual clarity. So varifocal off, you see a blurry image. Varifocal on, you see a sharp image. I mean, it's a little bit complicated to explain it to a non-expert in 2 minutes, right? But so basically, they motivated with this visual clarity. So this is great, and what we basically learned is that adaptively driving this accommodation works really well in a natural way, but we do need eye tracking. In addition to driving the focus cues for young people, we can also correct the refractive errors. So if you have myopia or hyperopia, we can at least correct for defocus. We can't correct for astigmatism in this case, but that's a big thing. As these devices get smaller, you may not be able to wear your eyeglasses underneath. What we also learned is that for presbyopes, you actually make the experience worse if you try to drive their accommodation. So presbyope is, again, somebody who cannot focus their eyes. You just need a fixed focal plane at exactly that distance. That's the best you can do, right? So if you try to drive an old person's accommodation, they're just going to see a blurry image. All right, so let's talk about light field displays a little bit, because that has been a very hot topic for the last couple of years also. And I just want to give you an intuition of what a light field really is in the context of a near-eye display. So let's think about our eye, and especially the pupil. So the pupil has a diameter of about 3 millimeters to 8 millimeters, depending on the lighting conditions. If it's very dark, it's going to get bigger. If it's brighter, it's going to get smaller. But it always has a finite size. And so you can think about it as a camera that has a finite-sized aperture that creates this retinal blur, this depth of field cue on the retina. So the light field is basically the wavefront that enters the pupil, and you can think about it as this. If you take a pinhole and you look through the pinhole, if you put it at any point in the pupil, you're going to see actually an image that has extended depth of field, so that has everything in focus. And as you slightly change the location of this pinhole over your pupil, you're going to see slightly different perspectives of the real world. It's very similar to stereo images, where you see one perspective from one eye, other perspective from the other eye. But in this case, you see many different images entering the pupil at slightly different perspectives, and they will integrate again on the retina to create this blur. And so the light field that enters the pupil is basically this collection of perspectives showing the same 3D scene from ever so slightly different perspectives. And so a light field display would try to create that light field in the head mount and then project it into these different parts of the pupil. So our approach to this was what we call the light field stereoscope. We also showed that at SIGGRAPH 2015. And the light field stereoscope was basically a hacked version of a head-mounted display where we have a backlight and an LCD panel. And then we have a little bit of a spacer, just about 6 millimeters wide. And then we have a second LCD panel. So a light ray that is emitted by the backlight would go through the LCD panel in the back, propagate a little bit more, then go through the LCD panel here again, and then go through the lenses. So the form factor of the device looks the same. And the goal now is to actually render a light field for each eye. In this case, we have this collection of pinhole images, in this case 7 by 7, that for you all look the same because they're so small, but there is a little bit of parallax in there that you don't see at this resolution really. And we want to synthesize this light field with the device. So what that means is that whatever we do with the display, at this part of the pupil, we need to project this image into there. We need to project this image into here, and we're going to have to project that image into here. So you can imagine that that's a pretty challenging engineering task. And the way we did that with our dual layer display, without too much going into the mathematical details, is we rendered the whole light field. Each pixel on this light field corresponds to one ray. we computed exactly the point of intersection on the front and the rear panel for each ray. All the pixels are shared between all the rays, but we can take the light field and then factor it into the best set of pixel states that, in the best sense, approximates this light field. And we used basically non-negative matrix and tensor factorization for that. So without going too much into detail here, I just want to show you what that looks like. So on the left, let's just look at the left, is a conventional head-mounted display without any focus cues, just an image rendered at one plane. If we defocus the camera and go back and forth, I mean, it's either fully in focus or out of focus. With this light field display on the right, without changing any optics, this is a static pattern on the pixels. And without any eye tracking, we can basically create this depth of field effect where you can accommodate at objects at different depths and create the retinal blur cues, which will then drive your accommodation, right? So again, this is really important for objects close by, anything you can touch. This is where the focus cues are most important. And yeah, it kind of did the thing that it was supposed to do. So this is all based on earlier technology that we worked on at MIT on multi-layer LCD displays. We call this the tensor display, for example, where we actually developed a lot of the algorithms of factoring a light field into this, set of pixel states on a multi-layer display, potentially even with time multiplexing here to capture with a high-speed camera. It's also related to an idea that we worked on for this vision correcting aspect. So in this case, we actually built a light field display by just taking a parallax barrier, which is one of the easiest ways of creating light field. You just lose a lot of light and resolution. You put it on an iPhone Touch, and you can correct for the aberrations in the eye digitally in this display. So here you see an image captured with the camera focused far away from the physical screen. So everything is out of focus. And this simulates a hyperopic viewer, basically. So you can't read the font, you can't read the buttons. But if we pre-compute this pattern and observe it through this parallax barrier display, we can create a light field that encodes a 2D image that floats outside the physical device, right? So we call it a vision correcting display. And the motivation was that we get so many pixels now. I mean, in 2014, 300 dpi was a lot. Now 3000 dpi maybe is a lot. But sometimes these pixels, you don't even see them anymore because they're beyond what we can actually resolve. So how do you use these pixels in a meaningful way? Well, we could do things like vision correction, driving focus cues, and just thinking about light fields as well. So then I'll talk about one more technology before highlighting some more open challenges, basically. So this is a slightly different approach to creating focus cues, which is not really creating focus cues, but trying to circumvent the problem that the lack of focus cues really creates. And in this case, I showed you this already earlier, right? If your eye accommodates at many different distances and there's only one image at some fixed plane, you're going to get this point spread function. So what people in optics and imaging have been doing is they have actually been working on techniques that are known as point spread function engineering. So in point spread function engineering, you can change the optics of a system to design the point spread function. And people have been using that for microscopy, for example, for super resolution localization microscopy or for creating all-in-focus images over a wider range. And we can use some of these techniques also for near-eye display design. So in this case, we, for example, looking at a point spread function that is the same irrespective of the depth at which the eye is accommodated. So in imaging, this is called extended depth of field, and we call it accommodation invariant display. So it doesn't matter where your eye accommodates, you should always see the same point spread function, which means that the image should always be in focus. So then the question is if we can drive the accommodation without this retinal blur cue by simply using these stereoscopic cues. So just to make that a little bit more clear, so our goal was to do optical engineering to remove this retinal blur cue, and then the hypothesis was that due to the cross-coupling, we could potentially drive the accommodation also with a binocular disparity, right? So, but you can't do that in rendering because the point spread function of the eye comes in from the accommodation state. So you have to change the optics for that. Okay, so how do we remove the blur cue? Well, the easiest way is to stop down the aperture. So you may know this from photography. If you have a large aperture or a small f number, you're going to get a very shallow depth of field. If you stop down the aperture, for example, to a large f number, then you're going to get a very large field of view, right? So you lose a lot of light in this case, and it may not be quite practical, but you could try to achieve the same effect in the eye, right? So let's say if the pupil is large, then you're going to get shallow depth of field. But if you can stop down the pupil somehow, then that would achieve that effect. So I haven't figured out a way of stopping down your pupil yet. if anybody's up for some psychophysical experiments, potentially with electrical stimulation, please let me know. but you know, people who are actually designing these displays are thinking a lot about the exit pupil, and that's basically the same, right? So in this case, we want to design the optics and the illumination in a way that it creates a virtual small pupil. So, for example, these are known as Maxwellian type displays or pinhole displays. So you can have, you know, a small point light that is focused exactly on one point of the pupil. So that creates a very small exit pupil. And then you could put your spatial light modulator in the optical path that is then conjugate with the retina. So you can actually scan out an image on the retina, ideally over a large field of view, but with a small exit pupil. So there's actually been a lot of work here at UW on this back in the 90s already, I think, from you guys with these scanned retinal displays, laser-based systems, and so on and so forth. So this is certainly a very interesting method. I mean, one of the challenges with these types of pinhole displays is that the eye actually moves quite a bit. The interpupillary distances are different for different people, right? Even if I just look over there, my pupil moves quite a lot. So you'd have to dynamically steer the exit pupil for the person. And for that, you again need eye tracking. There are a couple other problems like seeing floaters in your eyes. If you focus it through a very small part of your pupil, you see actually aberration in your own eye, or you can. So what we were thinking is, like, is there a way of getting large exit pupil and this extended depth of field? And we use this technique called extended depth of field, basically. So the idea is to use a focus tunable lens and to just change its focal power very rapidly, oscillating it over the whole depth without changing the image. So we just use a regular display that runs at 60 hertz, but we can oscillate this lens at a very fast rate that's much faster. And that will basically blur out the image over the entire accommodation range. And it creates a point spread function that has a finite size. So what that means is if we show an image on the screen, it's going to be convolved with this point spread function, and we see a slightly blurrier image on here, but it will be independent of the depth where the object is. And so then what we can do is we can deconvolve the image that we present on the screen, try to regain some of that sharpness to try to approximate the target image. So here's the image that we want. If we show that on a conventional display, there's a photograph. When it's in focus, it looks great, and the point spread function is very small. If a conventional image is out of focus, obviously it's going to get blurry, and the point spread function is large. With this accommodation invariant approach, we get slightly blurrier in the focal plane, but we get a lot sharper outside of the focal plane, and we have this depth invariant property. So now the hypothesis was, does that actually drive accommodation? And so again, we have a stimulus that changes over time. And if we do the conventional fixed focal plane design, again, in this case, we just used young users and a different set of users, we get a gain of around 35%. If we use the dynamic mode, in this case, again, only young people, so we get a higher gain actually on the dynamic mode, about 85%. And if we use this technique, the accommodation invariant display, we get about 60%. So it's somewhere in the middle, but it's statistically significant compared to the conventional mode. Again, this only works with stereoscopic displays because the stereo cues would now drive the accommodation. This wouldn't work with a monocular display. And we implemented that on our benchtop setup, but you can think about this also as a contact lens or some kind of optics that would create multiple focal planes at the same time. All right, so let's get back to this vision that we started out with, which is, you know, AR display, wide field of view, multiple focal planes in the form factor of that of glasses. And that's very challenging. And if we think about AR, that's way more challenging than VR. And there are a couple of things that we haven't really talked about that are specific to AR. So in AR, the idea is that we're going to combine light that comes from physical objects with that of digital objects, which wasn't the case for any of the VR stuff. And in this case, we need a beam combiner also. So the easiest way of doing that is using a beam splitter cube, such as this one, where we're going to have a digital display here that's going to be reflected into the eye. We have the real world that's going to get reflected in there too. But that's something that Google Glass used, and that the form factor isn't very good. So, you know, a lot of engineering challenges go into these waveguides where we have very thin optical elements, where we have a small projector, projects an image in here. There's some kind of a coupler that deflects the light into the waveguide. So we use total internal reflection. So the light bounces within the waveguide and then comes out here again. So we can do the same thing in a very small form factor. The idea of this beam combiner is the same as Pepper's Ghost. Basically, it's been around for a long time also. For example, in theater, where you have the audience here, you have an actor on stage, and then somebody dressed up as a ghost that's reflected towards the audience, and it the person will appear semi-transparent on the stage, right? Very similar to, I think Tupac Shakur had a live show after he was actually dead already. So there's all using digital technology that's very similar to this. So let's look at a couple of case studies. For example, Google Glass was using this very simple beam combiner design, but I think what they really did well was shrinking the electronics into a form factor that you could actually wear. So if you look at these patents, right, patent drawings, it's really very simple. There's an LED here, a reflective microdisplay. The image gets reflected from this curved reflector, which acts as a lens, basically, back to the eye. So you get a virtual image, again, floating somewhere in space, and the virtual image distance is defined by the curvature of this reflector. Same as the magnification. But then you also see the real world through this beam splitter. Meta is another technology that's out there right now. You can think about the Meta display as an analog of the simple magnifier design that we use in VR displays. In this case, we have a see-through beam splitter here. It's got a curved surface, and so whatever you show on the display up here is going to get magnified and reflected into the eye. So the field of view is very large, but the form factor is also pretty big. Microsoft HoloLens is actually a really well-designed and engineered piece of technology. It uses a waveguide already. It has a small field of view, but there are simply physical trade-offs that you have to make. It has light engines embedded in here where the images are projected into the waveguide. They bounce around inside the waveguide, come out somewhere else. So it's really something that works quite well. And you can actually read up the details on this waveguide in the patent that's called waveguide, I think. So you can see the idea here again. You have a little projector, projects an image in here, bounces around, actually comes out at multiple different positions. So a couple of the challenges that are there is that this eye box versus field of view trade-off. What does that mean? Well, we want to have a very small projector that projects an image into the waveguide that comes out here. Our eye moves quite a bit, so we want to make sure that we can magnify the pupil, right? This is the entrance pupil, this is the exit pupil, or the eye box. In order to see an image for us, we need to be able to move our pupil in that large area. So we can magnify that, but we also want to get a large field of view. So the field of view is basically the magnification of the display. This is the microdisplay, gets projected on the retina, and we want to stretch that out as much as we can. So we want to magnify that too. So now we want to magnify this image on the retina, and we want to magnify the pupil on the eye box, and we can't do both at the same time. This is this concept known as étendue. We can only magnify one and thereby minifying the other. We can't get both at the same time. So that's a big challenge. Then chromatic aberrations are usually a challenge, right? You can have a microprojector. If you have a diffractive optical element that is just etched on the piece of glass here or some other material, I mean, you're going to get chromatic aberrations no matter what you do on the display side, and it's something that's very difficult to correct optically. So people have come up with all kinds of ways of correcting for chromatic aberrations in these things, such as using stacked waveguides for different wavelengths. So for example, if you have a different waveguide for the green wavelength, that would be good, because then blue and red are not quite as important, and you can differently engineer all of these. And you could potentially put these at different depths too to get a multifocal plane display or something like that. Or you can use a volume hologram where you can actually correct for these chromatic aberrations. I'd say one of the big challenges is mutually consistent occlusions in optical see-through AR. Just to give you a sense of what that means, is like if I have a real object here and a digital object, the beam combiner simply additively combines them, right? So that means the objects always look semi-transparent, the digital objects. So there's an easy case, which is the Pokemon is behind the actual real object, in which case, if I have a depth camera, I can simply not render the Pokemon wherever the physical object is, and it appears as if it's occluded by the tree. But the other case, where the Pokemon is in front of the tree, that's really hard, because now I would actually have to block real light coming from the tree with physically sharp boundaries in the scene, and that's very difficult, because I need a different type of a modulation technology that actually selectively blocks the real light. And so this is a big challenge that nobody has a great answer for. So I'm also teaching a course, E267 at Stanford, where the goal is to build a headset. So it's not so much application focused, really build the headset. Everybody gets this kit with LCD displays, and we implement stereo rendering, just rendering in general. We have a little board that has an IMU on this, which you don't see here. But so we do orientation tracking with sensor fusion. We have photodiodes on there now, so we do pose tracking as well. And if you just want to read up more on the technology itself, I think this is a good resource because all the materials are on the website. My group actually works on a couple of different things, not just VR, AR. Work on displays in general. We work on light field cameras. We work on image processing deconvolution for fluorescent microscopy. Work on optimizing optical elements in general and just low-level computer vision. And we actually work a lot on time of flight and non-line of sight imaging, so looking around corners with pulse lasers and picosecond detectors is a big topic for us. And what I shared with you today was just a small part. Some of the things that will be coming up is at SIGGRAPH this year, we're showing this non-line of sight imaging in live. And then we've also been working on actually getting some of these technological components, like these focus tunable lenses, into real-world glasses. So I showed you that people, as they age, get presbyopia, so they can't correct for the focus anymore. And the current way of correcting that is to use either reading glasses or bifocals or progressive glasses. But in all of these cases, you actually reduce the field of view for any focal distance. So the natural way of focus that we have when we're young is we just look at an object and our focus is automatically driven there. And you can recreate that, but in order to do that, we actually have these eye tracking cameras that track the vergence distance, which is, gives us a sense of how far away the object is. Then we also have a depth camera, the Intel RealSense here, that we use for a little bit of sensor fusion. Sorry. A little bit of sensor fusion, so we get an estimate of how far away the object is that the person looks at any given point in time, and then we can dynamically adjust their focal power. So we call it autofocals because it's an automatically focusing pair of eyeglasses. So with this, I think that's it for today. I'd like to thank my students, Robert and Nitish, long-term collaborator Fuchang, who was at NVIDIA Research but just moved to Apple, and then Emily Cooper is also a long-term collaborator. This is the rest of my group. Thanks for your attention. I'd be happy to answer any other questions that you may have.
Time for questions from the audience.
A lot of the signal you display, how is the energy requirement? You need to display more lights to do the light field display, and can you comment on that?
Great question. So the question is, what are the trade-offs, right? Like you can gain some of these capabilities, but what do you lose? And I think one thing I learned is that there's no free lunch. You always have to give up something. And in the academic world, we have the freedom of building big benchtop setups, but if you actually want to make a product, there are a lot of other requirements on size, weight, power, and so on and so forth, right? So the light field display in particular is actually fundamentally limited by diffraction. So the resolution is something that is challenging to scale to very high resolution, simply because you're looking through an array of very small apertures in the first panel onto the second panel. So as you make that smaller and smaller to get higher resolution, the diffraction limited resolution actually gets worse. Also, you lose a lot of light. LCD is only about 6% efficient or so, so you lose 94% of the light every time you go through an LCD. On the computational side, the light field is very expensive. So normally you render a stereoscopic image pair. In this case, we render 50 images in total per frame. So that's 25 images for the right eye, 25 images for the left eye. So that's a significantly higher rendering cost. And then we solve this nonlinear optimization problem based on that light field to compute the patterns that go on the pixels. I mean, we were able to implement in real time on the GPU for moderately high resolution, so about 1280 by 800 for both eyes, which is not very high. And that worked in real time, but there are significant computational challenges, and with that, also power requirements, right? So I think the varifocal approach that I showed, where you actuate the display or change the focal power, that's something that would require a little bit more power, actually, but that may be feasible. So if you want to build a really high-quality AR display that actually has calibration between what you see and the real world, you need eye tracking anyways, because you know what the relationship between the world and the display is, but unless you know also where the eye is, you can't really show the object at a precise point, right? If you have eye tracking anyways, then it makes sense to build on top of that and have some kind of a gaze-contingent technique, right? But there are other challenges with gaze-contingent techniques, especially in AR, that may not apply to all different incarnations. So there are always different trade-offs, and I think depending on what your constraints are and what your applications are, different of these technologies may apply. Yeah.
In addition to gaze tracking, is it feasible to measure a person's accommodation using the curvature of their eyeball or something, and just solve the problem of accommodation entirely in software using?
Yeah, that's a great idea. Actually, it's one of my midterm questions in the VR class. Can you solve this vergence-accommodation conflict in software, right? So the answer is no. You can't, without going into the accommodation tracking. I'll get back to that in a second. So if you have a fixed focal plane display, it doesn't matter what image you show on that plane, it will always be the sharpest image, because if the eye accommodates at any other distance, it will still be sharper if you're accommodating to that physical plane, right? So if I change the image on this screen, it doesn't matter for the accommodation state of my eye will still be accommodating on the physical screen. Because if it accommodates anywhere else, it's going to be more blurry than it is on the screen. Does that make sense? Okay, so any software approach would only change the pixel values on the screen, but it doesn't optically move the screen. So it doesn't change your accommodation, because your accommodation will be driven to that plane.
But in that case, there's still a problem with the Varifocal approach, the moving plane, because you can only change the focus of the entire plane, and we do have, well, the ability to tell what the focus is outside of our phobia as well.
That's an excellent point, right? And that's a big limitation for varifocal displays. You can only globally change it. The thing is, accommodation is only driven by the phobia, which is only about 1 degree or so, or the foviola at least, 1 degree of the visual field. So only this small, right? Like this is 2 degrees about your thumb at arm's length. So only this part of your visual field is actually important for driving accommodation. And after that, the visual acuity drops off so dramatically that the blur doesn't really make a difference anymore. So if you have precise eye tracking, which has to be much more precise than 1 degree and very fast, then a globally adjusting focal plane is actually perfectly fine. And it's very difficult to see the difference, right? So it'll be fine. What you can do is you can actually render in the retinal blur to make it more plausible, the image. So you don't need to leave it completely sharp. You can render in the right blur, but you still need to globally adjust it to whatever your gaze position is.
But so to render the right blur, you do need to record the focus of the eye.
You don't, because you assume that it's at wherever the optical distance is of the focal plane. So your actuator of the varifocal display has to have some kind of a feedback mechanism to tell you where that plane is. But you can think about the plane as guiding your focus. So as long as you know where the plane is and you know the prescription and you assume that they can actually accommodate in that range, then they will always be accommodated at that plane. So tracking accommodation in a small form factor is actually very hard. And also, I don't know if it's really useful, but you can use light field cameras or Shack-Hartman type sensors to measure the curvature of the eye. But I think the best scenario would be globally adjusting it depending on your gaze and then rendering it the blur everywhere else to make it most plausible and actually drive accommodation. Hopefully that answered your question. Oops, sorry. So you had the question.
Are there any physical constraints to or limits to getting like a like retinal resolution pass-through display? So there's kind of 2, I would see, long-term approaches. Like one is a pass-through display for AR. The other one is to just completely recreate the real light field with some kind of display technology. And so I was curious if you know of any constraints that would make one or the other over the long term the only real viable option.
Well, you can create retinal resolution type displays, but over a small field of view. I mean, it's really the pixel count that matters, right? And I think industry has been pushing for more and more pixel resolution, and it doesn't really make sense to go beyond 4K or 8K on a big television. It really only makes sense if you stretch that display over the entire visual field, because, I mean, if you do the math, and we have, visual field of about maybe 160 degrees horizontally, maybe 135 degrees vertically per eye. If you assume that retinal resolution is about 58 or 60 points per visual degree, then that's about 9,000 by 8,000 pixels that you would need per eye to get that retinal resolution. So in that case, you either need to have a panel that has that resolution, or you have to dynamically steer a smaller foveated kind of a screen, right? You could combine optically like a large field of view display with a small field of view display that both have where only the small field of view actually has high pixel density, and if you can track that with your gaze, that would probably be enough too. Yeah, but then the bandwidth is a challenge. We don't have that number of pixels. We can't really drive it. GPUs can't really render that high resolution in real time, and so on and so forth.
I think we have maybe time for one. one more question. We're running.
You had a question. Sorry.
Well, I had a very quick technical clarity to the last question, which was, in your research, what was the frame rate or the speed you needed to do this tracking for the eye? It seems very challenging mechanically to keep up with a person's eyes. Maybe.
Yeah, so eye tracking is it seems simple, but it's actually very difficult to get it to work right. So we actually used a stereoscopic eye tracker from a company called Pupil Labs in Berlin. They have this open source eye tracker, runs at 120 hertz. It worked okay. I mean, they specify the accuracy with below 2 degrees. It sounds like not much, but 2 degrees, that's the size of your phobia, right? So, so I think eye tracking sounds simple, but it's actually very hard to do right. And we don't claim that.
You used for your autofocus, was that?
Oh, the autofocus uses the Pupil Labs tracker. Yeah, so we didn't custom develop this. Like we changed the software, the control mechanism by incorporating the information from the RealSense, which is actually much slower than the eye tracker. But we know what the distance is of the scene everywhere. We know kind of the vergence, which is noisy, and we kind of developed a hacky version of a sensor fusion algorithm there. Yeah. Sorry, I'll also be around for a bit if you want to talk more.
Sorry. Okay, sure.
Oh yeah, I was just going to ask, are there any major differences in solving this VAC issue for AR versus VR? Because I know AR has both the digital and sort of real.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question, actually. So most people talk about it in the context of VR, actually. And so I've only been talking about it in VR. And VR, the problems of visual clarity, potentially discomfort, eye strain, things like that, right? In AR, you have the real object also. So you don't actually know exactly where the person is actually going to accommodate. If there are conflicting stimuli between the physical object and the digital object, and they're supposed to be at the same distance, I mean, I don't know exactly where the user is going to accommodate. It's going to be potentially driven by the stereoscopic cues, by the relative brightness of these objects, and so on and so forth, right? So just creating a consistent representation is actually much more challenging. Also, then it doesn't just matter to drive accommodation, which is the big goal for VR. For VR, you just want to drive accommodation somewhere close to where you're supposed to be, and that's good. For AR, you need to create consistent retinal blur cues between the two also. And so I think the precision has to be a lot better in that case for focus cues. And I think it's a lot more important to get them right for AR.
Just a follow-up, you mentioned that you can measure the vergence. Why can't you use the vergence to measure the distance?
Because fundamentally these two cues mismatch in VR, right? So vergence, I can measure the vergence by just taking, if I know the IPD and the gaze angles for both eyes, I can roughly estimate the vergence angle, which is the angle between these two lines. But the accommodation will be probably somewhere else, right?
Yeah, but it's like you want the accommodation to be at the position from where the vergence is?
Right. Yeah, you want that, but it doesn't necessarily happen.
The vergence, then you know where the accommodation you want to have?
Oh, yeah. So that's what you'd like to. So you can measure vergence and then try to drive accommodation there. But it's very difficult to measure vergence precisely because such small angles, such small changes in this angle, it gets very noisy, right? I mean, that's what the eye tracking does. So the eye tracking actually either measures vergence, or if you have computer-generated content, you can do gaze angle and do a lookup in the depth map also of the rendered scene. Or you can fuse both. But usually you would measure vergence angle that tells you where you would want to drive the accommodation. That's what the eye tracking does.
For AR, you have to understand the depth in the surrounding. You can't just use the vergence as a...
Oh, for the presbyopic glasses?
Yeah.
I mean, vergence tracking is just very noisy, right? So that's why we also wanted the depth information, just to have more robust information, basically. But if you had a clean vergence tracker, that's all you need. Yeah.
All right, JJ, you have some more questions. My questions were quite answered. Like I was about to ask, like in an AR situation, if you like the eye tracking doesn't really necessarily give you depth information because the scene is not synthetic.
Yeah.
So yeah. But I guess if you use a depth map, if you have a depth camera, then it's give you the rough estimate.
Yeah, I mean, some of the headsets, the AR headsets, like the Meta, I mean, they use time-of-flight cameras, I think HoloLens too, right? Mostly for hand tracking then, but I mean, you could use it for other things too. I mean, at the end of the day, you want as much information as you can of the real world and the digital world. And then optically combine them in a seamless way, getting the lighting effects to be consistent, getting the shadows and shading to be consistent, getting these occlusions, right? That's really hard. There's a lot of excellent work here going on. I mean, some of you are working on this probably, like this lighting estimation problem, right? I mean, that's one thing to do that on a cell phone, but then on an optical device, I mean, it's even harder, doing relighting, things like that. There's just so many different challenges, which makes it such an exciting topic.
Okay, well, let's thank you.